The New Enlightenment Project provides a series of educational interviews on the enduring qualities of reason and compassion which define humanism. In this, the first of two sessions with historian, linguist, politician, and Metis-Cree elder Keith Goulet, we explore the history and application of the Doctrine of Discovery as espoused by the 15th century Roman Catholic Church. We also explore Dr. Goulet's family roots that contributed to a political movement of Métis, and we explore humanism within the Aboriginal context. Keith, your family is from the Métis side of Cumberland House in northern Saskatchewan, and you became the first Aboriginal cabinet minister in the province. I want to touch on that background a little later, but first I want to reference your PhD. It's entitled Land and Colonization, a Nehinew, is that right? Nehinew perspective. It will become a published book.
Yes.
You begin this work by discussing the Doctrine of Discovery. As most of the listeners will know, the Pope apologized for Catholic residential schools, but ignored requests that he revoke the doctrine. What is this Doctrine of Discovery, and what role did it play in colonization?
Yes, the Doctrine of Discovery had been proceeding along in the 1400s, and in regards to North America, and in regards to the Doctrine of Discovery itself. The Doctrine of Discovery was actually done 1 year after Christopher Columbus was around in 1492. So it was done in 1493. So this was a Doctrine of Discovery. The basic point of the Doctrine of Discovery was the non-recognition of indigenous lands in the Americas. Although these were the people that were the jurisdictional authority over all of the lands in various different ways, they did not recognize it, and it was pretty clear from the statement of the Doctrine of Discovery that it was one where they therefore focused on the Europeans. As a lot of people will say, a lot of the European history is quite Eurocentric, particularly in the earlier days. It's getting better in the more modern days, but it was a very strong positioning on Eurocentrism. And the aspect of so they focus on the Eurocentrism. That means that in terms of land and in terms of other things, that indeed it was only the English, the French, and the Spanish and other European people that were recognized in terms of other land. They were fighting over lands and so on. There would be recognition on that. Then there was also another important aspect of the Doctrine of Discovery, because the church had been a strong, from the Middle Ages onwards, a strong part of political governance. It was also a recognition of the church that it had to be Christian. So there's two aspects. The Christian Europeans, therefore, were the ones who could exchange land and control lands without really recognizing indigenous peoples.
Well, basically, it said that non-Christian, in this case, Aboriginal people, but in Europe earlier, it applied to North Africans and Saracens and whatnot, or earlier versions of it. It was basically saying that non-Christians could be colonized without recognition of any title. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. They, as a matter of fact, there was a big debate on it in Spain in the early 1500s.
Yeah.
And so not that long after that, it was going on, and because what was happening was that there was already the beginnings of slavery, and the first part of slavery was in the enslaving of indigenous peoples. A little bit later on, you would have the enslaving of the blacks coming in. So that was an aspect that they looked at. So when they had the debate in 1537, we had the Pope delivered a papal bull. And in the papal bull, he finally states that, because they were debating not only in religious terms, they were debating in terms that indigenous people were really people. Sometimes you see, that animals, beasts, and all that type of thing in history, you see that written about, and other words have been used. But the Pope finally says they're truly men, is what he says. But the other thing that he says is that they had the right to property, which was not happening, but that's what he was saying as well. So it was an important document for the day, but it wasn't really followed. And another big debate took place by the mid-1550s, in the early 1550s, where you had different scholars were debating it, and you had Sepulveda and Lascazes, Lascazes being pro-indigenous, debating that whole point, those points. Okay. And so the fact that they were debating slavery, they still did continue slavery. Slavery, did move on, and we saw enslavement of indigenous people in not only in Spanish-controlled areas, but English-controlled areas in North America. Both in the United States and Canada. So it was an important debate that was taking place, because you were seeing the evolution of a strong, although slavery had existed before, it was a strong move as it did become in the United States. And a lot of blacks were brought in great numbers, and and along with the indigenous people, and others were enslaved. But it was something that was there. So the doctrine of discovery, in its context, was dealing with all these issues during the day, and to a certain extent, the English were criticizing the Spanish on their treatment to indigenous peoples, but they themselves weren't as good did a lot of things that weren't very good either, and things like that.
So it was fundamental to colonization as we've experienced it. In what ways did the 1763 Royal Proclamation modify the application of the Doctrine of Discovery in most of British North America?
What it was is that when I look at the Proclamation of 1763, and I looked at the spring of 1763, the new leader of Canada was pretty tough on people, and he was known that way. I mean, he had fought already in the Battle of Culloden, in 1749, and as part of that, and he had come into Canada, and to a great extent, therefore, he was more of your typical top-down, everything a top-down approach on decision making and things like that, and he didn't realize the things that were done in the fur trade already. The fact that you needed to accept certain indigenous ways, you needed to do certain that the trade itself was reciprocal benefit rather than benefit to one side. So in many cases, he started doing such stuff as not letting out ammunition, which was required for hunting and all of that. And what happened is that some people know the history of Pontiac, but it wasn't only Pontiac; it was others as well that did come together, and they captured these British forts. And a lot of people were looking at it, and they said, "Holy mackerel! These guys can actually capture." I think it was 8 or 9 forts, and it was a shock to their system that after defeating the French, you now have indigenous people. You fight them, and they're taking over key forts. And so what happened is that over time they renegotiated, and it didn't take long, and they were able to come out with a proclamation of 1763 in the fall. And it's that document that becomes pretty good. And an interesting thing from an Indigenous viewpoint on it was that there was a case where the representatives of the sovereign were dealing with them in actually the first written document, and they were dealing with them as not only tribes but nations. In that document, it says nations and tribes.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look at that document in 1763, it more or less confirmed that the documents of the 1600s were written the same way. That indeed, when I looked at that period in time, in 1749, for example, we had the Isham documents. There's about a thick document through the Hudson Bay Archives, and in it there's 66 pages of indigenous language, conversation, which means that this guy knew Cree language, because I read the stuff and it was pretty good the way it was written, and he says that both him and Graham during that period say that indigenous lands were not only a small little area, communal landholding or things like that. They called indigenous people, the words they used were state, country, and nation. Those are the words they used. So the word tribe that enters into the thing is starting to be used. But it's treated as nation because the basis of the document is nation to nation, a nation to nation document. But you still have the aspect of British control on it. But it was a thing where it also helped a lot of the new settlers. A lot of people forget that there was a lot of good stuff in there on land for the new settlers, but also for indigenous peoples, that they had to have treaties done, not only in the back rooms, of the nation. Sometimes they try to buy off one leader, against another and do things up in the back room and do deals like that. The basis was to be done in regards to what indigenous people wanted, and that was to make sure that it was done in a public format. Yep. So this would be not only a private land deal, it was public nation to public nation. And the representatives of thereof had to do the decision in regards to the treaty itself. So the idea of treaties, the basis of treaty making, which had already started before, was rearranged and redone in 1763. Some of the more strong nationalists still disagree with it, but in many cases, most people in the modern day, including indigenous peoples, have looked upon it as a very important jump-off spot in regards to relationships between indigenous peoples and Europeans.
Okay. So the Royal Proclamation, it recognized sovereignty. Was that a full sovereignty or a partial sovereignty? Can you describe that for me, Keith?
Yeah, the word sovereignty, of course, it's an historical term, and in many cases we call parliamentary system sovereignty. They don't have. Many of them don't have kings and queens. Some have remnants of the kings and queens, as in England, as a basis, but they're not in a decision-making power position.
Yeah.
So the word sovereign comes from kings and queens, and that history, that happened, from the early days onwards. So the word sovereign has been used, and for indigenous people, they look upon it that way as well. I mean, it's one of dealing with authority and jurisdiction over land and over governance. Yep. And obviously for indigenous people, when they're negotiating, that's what they are talking about. This is their land and so on. And it's an important, so it's therefore an important document. Yep. It continues to be a bit of a point of debate, but it also is one that is still used in regard to a lot of argumentation in a modern day.
Well, of course, the 13 colonies, they viewed the Royal Proclamation as a document, a law that inhibited their unfettered expansion westward. So we could say that was a factor in the subsequent revolution in 1776. But the British, what was left of British North America, i.e. Canada, had a different path. And in 2014, the Canadian Supreme Court ruled that the Doctrine of Discovery never applied to Canada. And if the doctrine has no application, I don't know if you agree with that, but if the doctrine has no application, why have Canadian Aboriginal groups called on the Pope to rescind it?
Well, it was pretty clear that the basis of the authority, which did come from the Pope, included not only and of course the church, changed to the Church of England, but not till 1500 and so on, after Henry VIII. So it is one where people say, the Doctrine of Discovery puts on the pedestal Europeans. And Europeans were in South America, North America, including Canada. And that has always been the argument. They say people can't hide from it. It's not only in religious terms, it's in reality terms of it. And a lot of the ways of taking possession on land and territory, besides some of the wars, was that they had charter companies, and one of which was the Hudson Bay Company in 1670. And these charter companies became to be used, as a basis for trade, number one, and also for settlement, because that type of thing in the north, in regards to Canada, they call that area that covered the land mass of what 1/3 of Western Canada, Rupert's Land, of which the Hudson Bay was supposed to do their trading in. But the focus on that document, on the charter, is on the trade itself. It wasn't settlement. If I look at Jamestown and their document, they focus in on the settlement and the development of the settlements, etc. It's very explicit there, but not in the case of Rupert's Land, the Rupert's Land document, or the Royal Charter of 1670.
So Rupert's Land did not challenge or change nationhood or sovereignty.
Yes, as a matter of fact, they were an example of it. By that I mean, all of a sudden, with a flick of the pen, the Hudson Bay Company gets 1/3 of Western Canada.
Yeah.
No negotiations, no treaties, no nothing.
In any event, the Pope came to Canada earlier this year and apologized on behalf of the Catholic Church for the Indian residential schools, but he ignored requests to rescind the Doctrine of Discovery. Why would apologizing for residential schools be easier for him than rescinding the doctrine?
Yeah, I was surprised with that. Given the Pope's, although it's been spotty in regards to some of his decisions, but a lot of his decisions were what a lot of some people would say, they're quite progressive, and that they're moving forward with the time, and a lot more so than previous popes. But in this case, people were extremely surprised when that didn't happen, but I think it may be because it was such a major central thing in the history of the Catholic Church, the Doctrine of Discovery.
I see.
I mean, it wasn't evangelicals or the, although they are connected as Christians, or, with the Anglicans, although they themselves are connected, with the Roman Catholics through Christianity, that, that indeed it's a history of that, that makes argument, a lot stronger in regards to Indigenous peoples and this doctrine of discovery idea, and making sure that, of course, it still hits out not only at Canada, but also the Pope, and that's where they pointed their direction at.
Now, your father's family was originally from the Saint Laurent Métis in northern Manitoba, and your mother was a carrier, I believe, from Cumberland House. So you're Métis on both sides of your family. Would there have been a Métis nation without something like the Doctrine of Discovery?
Yeah, there's a big debate on it, other than just the community of Cumberland House, or the community of Red River, or different communities in Ontario. People have various viewpoints on it. In regards to the Métis idea and the Métissage idea in Cumberland House, when I was growing up, the word Métis was not used. And what they used instead was a concept of Apitaygusan, which means half the son of. Of course, it immediately raises a question: why not half the daughter of? Why was it called half the son of? And I think that there was borrowing and sharing taking place between Indigenous people and Europeans. Sometimes they borrowed, to represent something like the province of Saskatchewan. Obviously, we name it after a Cree name, which is from our community as well. And that, so they name it, but other sides, they take the more English view. In this case, the Crees had seen that the genealogical aspect of Europeans and the naming of people were controlled by men. Your name of the family was by the man. So when they did their document, it's pretty clear to them, contrary to the Cree, where the Cree could either be through the man or through the woman. In this case, it was through the man. Yeah. And I think that the idea of Apitaygusan therefore clicks onto the idea of patriarchy, and the fact that although we are, as Crees, partially with the mother's side, it's now being overtaken gradually, especially with the intermarriage with Europeans, the patriarchy side.
Yeah. And
I think that's what it represented, and that's my thinking on it. I believe that the people. It's interesting when I talk in Cree about an English when I was growing up as a child.
Well, let's go with that.
Yeah?
Sorry.
When I was growing up as a child, we called the fact was we talked about Scottish half-breeds, French half-breeds, and English half-breeds. Those are the words we used. But in Cree, we also used Nehinew. We also used Cree half-breeds. So in Cree, when you talk on half-breed side, it's not only completely Eurocentric, you are now actually including Cree Métis in there. There are some people who have a tough time handing out, can it be Cree and Métis at the same time? But in fact, that's what we say.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting thing. So that debate on the Métis idea, where the European side is sometimes put in a higher pedestal, and sometimes the Indigenous side is. In this case, and the European side of the history tended to be greater than the Indigenous side. The development of the Indigenous side on the Métis is now being debated. You see that with the debate in Manitoba, Ontario, Saskatchewan, etc.
Well, I'm glad that you introduced your personal background in Cumberland here, because I'd like to show you a picture
Okay.
And it's from the Glenbow Museum in Calgary.
Right.
And I think you were probably, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 in the picture, and your father is sitting front and center.
I see the picture.
Excellent. Can you talk a little bit about a little bit about that picture, please?
Yes. This picture was done about in 1950. I was about 4 years old. I'm on the right hand side here, and my dad is in the middle. My mother is directly behind my dad, and the rest of the family is there. There's also two women there that came and worked with us at the cabin. There was also, not shown here, there was a tent over here and another tent over this side. There's usually about 3-4 families that used to go and live out together. And it didn't matter. The ones that lived with us, we were technically not treaty. We were classified as half-breeds. But the other ones over here on both sides were classified as treaty First Nations people. And so a lot of people seem to think that the Métis, fished on their own versus the treaty, but it was intermixed. It depended on what people did and from what area they came in. So you had a mixture of people fishing, hunting, and trapping with First Nations and people all the way through that time. My dad was here. My older brother Jimmy was here. He died in oil rigs, when I was growing up, and I mean later on when I was in grade 12, and he was quite helpful in trapping. I remember him trapping. Later on, when I was a little bit older, I did the same as well. But we went out to these spring trapping things 2 months of the year. In other words, we weren't in school for those 2 months. We were out there on the trap line going to school on the book of nature, surrounding us, and all the activities that we did. And it was a great experience. I was really happy that I went through that experience and could relate to the connection to the land, a lot more clear.
Excellent. Well, thank you. But one of the significant aspects that picture is who took it. It was taken by Jim Brady.
Yes, it was taken by Jim Brady, and he used to. Jim Brady has been. I went to a special, presentation, of his pictures over in Prince Albert here last week, and his children were there, and etc. But when I was growing up, we were doing the cooperative development, and the cooperative development was relatively easy because the ideology of Indigenous peoples was more collectivist than Europeans. You were tended to be a lot more individualistic, but even the Europeans saw the need for the development of co-ops, so they evolved and developed them in this past century. And so you saw this idea of the co-ops, therefore, forming in the community. So my dad was there, and I remember that Jim Brady used to come around. It wasn't only Jim Brady. There was Angus Thomas, my dad's brother-in-law, Pierre Carrier, Jim Carrier, and there was many others, that were part of this. Lawrence Cook. There is many people that were involved in this PAPA idea. So the leadership in the community tends to be dispersed, rather than centralized to 1 or 2 persons. It's dispersed out in the community, and as such, you saw that in the co-op movement, it was good for the co-op movement to have that, different groups in the community, be part of it. And as such, the co-op store did evolve and develop, and the reason, one of the major reasons, is not only collectivist ideology. It was a challenge to the monopoly of the Hudson Bay Company. The Hudson Bay Company had a store, and they could charge what they wanted to do in that store. And in many cases, people knew when they were buying stuff in the Palm Manitoba or in Nipawin, that hey, the prices are different. Over here we're paying higher prices, and part of it we understand to be transportation, but not that much. That there was a lot much more much more taken. So a lot of the people did it because of pragmatic reasons. They wanted, hey, I want to, definitely pay for my things that I buy, but I want, a fair price for it. And much the same way, historically, when they negotiated in the fur trade, they always wanted a fair price. They wanted a better price, and that's why they ended up negotiating with not only the Hudson Bay Company, but the so-called, French companies, the Northwest Company, as it evolved into over time. And even in the modern day, we see that again. People are sometimes developing new stores and things like that, and they shift and change in regards to where they want, but they will still shop in the outlying areas where they may get better prices.
So would it be fair to say that your family, from its earliest roots, were among the local leaders and political activists, part of the Métis movement? Would that be fair?
Yes, that would be quite fair. My grandfather was LCR Goulet from Red River, and he was part of the Rial's leadership team. He was second in command on the military side, and they were part of that Red River thing. And after the death of one of the settlers, the people came in. The army had come in with a lot of people into Winnipeg, and they ended up. But my grandfather was killed trying to get away from them by trying to swim across the river, and he I think is that what they say in Cree, they stoned him to death with and drowned him through that way, through rocks, they said. And that's how they told the story in Cree, because people are telling a story about my grandfather. And it's interesting, when I was making a little statement about that one time, I got a letter from Winnipeg, and it said, that couldn't have been your grandfather, because LCR Goulet, their kids are these, and none of them are related to your dad's dad. In other words, my dad's dad was a cousin to this, but he wasn't recognized by this person who was sending me this letter. And of course, the person was making a truthful argument from a French viewpoint, because the relational structure, the kinship structure in Cree was different than the French structure. The French structure, it was correct to say great uncle, but in Cree it's not. We say Nimushu, my grandfather, and that's how we say it. So for us, it's correct to say my grandfather, but obviously some people still don't understand the difference in terms of language use, and how it not only challenges at a small degree, but to a greater degree, it challenges some of those concepts that people do have. And so that aspect is there for a family, but also with the carriers. You had somebody die in Batoche, and others had relationships with others as well. So you saw that in Cumberland and other communities in Western Canada, that we had relatives that were part of it, but we were also relatives of First Nations people. We were relatives to the Cree. Our mothers were just as important, and our grandmothers were just as important, as the men, traveled to Cumberland. So, and in that sense, it was actually in society, we travel where the man goes, but the man were traveling to where the women were. And they were living according to how the women were living in that situation. So we were raised as Crees and as Cree speakers. And it's only later on in life you get to understand the political identical terminology, that takes place.
Well, I'll get to the Cree side a little bit later, but for now, the significance for our viewers of Jim Brady and Malcolm Norris is they are credited as being the organizers for the early Métis Society in both Saskatchewan and I believe Alberta as well. Now, they were both secularists, atheists, politically left-wing. Is this humanist strain still prominent within the Métis movement?
You're seeing that strain still existing. Even in Manitoba, where there's a strong statement being made that we are Christian Métis.
Mm-hmm.
You're still seeing a lot of people have a problem with that because it needs community, like even in Cumberland. When I talk to the elderly, whether they're Cree First Nations or Métis, that they didn't like the split that was taking place in the community between traditional Indigenous believers and Christians. But not only that division, the division was when I went to school, a big difference between an Anglican and a Roman Catholic, and they were split that way. And the children Anglicans were moved out of the classroom where we had half hour of Catholic teachings every day. And so when I talk to the older people, they always talk about the divisions, not only in the classroom, but in other areas as well, and that there was always people that were emphasizing the division, but other people in the community always wanted to deal with the togetherness, of working together. And that's how that ideology continues to operate.
One of the members of our New Enlightenment project, Chris DiCarlo, taught a graduate class in philosophy at Wilfrid Laurier University. He suggested that given our common human origins in East Africa, any racist philosophy is untenable. Chris was then subjected to a disciplinary hearing for being insensitive to the Aboriginal teaching that a creator placed Aboriginal people on the American continents. Is Aboriginal spirituality and humanism necessarily in conflict?
In certain cases, for people, it's like taking any religion. And if you take Indigenous spirituality, there's quite a variety of concepts within it. And there's also a variety of what you conceptualize as the most important. I mean, we see Christianity has evolved into many, many different types of religions over time. And it's because people disagree with it. And I see that on Indigenous spirituality, it's not one whole same thing. There are differences, across Canada. And the idea of humanism is more, Indigenous philosophy is more on the idea, and I looked at it in terms of the debates, when I looked at the idea of humanism and personhood. And I looked at that and I said, it's an important aspect of the true philosophy, but it falls short. Basically, because the idea for Cree, when we classify things on a broad level, we call it the animate and inanimate system. When we classify it that way, we are not talking about people only. We are talking about all living aspects of the universe. We are talking about not only people, but animals are important for life. Berries and also the roots that we dig for medicines. These are all part of life, and that therefore the anthropomorphic thought where people are the center of the universe is a bit problematic, and that and that has been debated, of course, within European thought as well. But in Indigenous thought, it's the lifehood argument. It's life and survival itself that are at the essence of the argument, rather than people only.
The New Enlightenment Project is committed to increasing civil discussion of difficult or controversial topics, such as the one we just had with Keith Goulet. This was the first of a two-part series. In the second interview, I draw on Dr. Goulet's expertise as a linguist in discussing the Cree clan system and traditional worldview. I also ask him to draw lessons from his experience as a politician with respect to the movement he represents and the compatibility of Aboriginal spirituality to humanism. You can visit our website at nep-humanism.ca, where you can watch more interviews in this series, browse our blog, become a member, or make a donation. We are also on Facebook. You can subscribe to our podcasts and webinars at YouTube at nep-humanism. Thank you, and see you next time.